Oklahoma gives landlords broad freedom to set and raise rent, consistent with the state's overall landlord-friendly regulatory approach. The governing law is found in the Oklahoma Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Title 41 of the Oklahoma Statutes, and while it establishes important procedural requirements for the landlord-tenant relationship, it places no restrictions on the amount a landlord can charge for rent. Oklahoma does not have rent control or rent stabilization of any kind. There is no state statute that caps rent increases, limits how often a landlord can raise rent, or requires any government approval before a rent change takes effect. Oklahoma's political and regulatory environment has consistently favored property rights and market-based pricing, and there has been no significant legislative movement toward rent regulation. Oklahoma has not enacted a specific preemption statute prohibiting local rent control, but no Oklahoma municipality has enacted or seriously considered local rent restrictions either. Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Norman, Broken Arrow, Lawton, and every other Oklahoma city operate under the same market-based framework. Given the state's political climate, local rent control is extremely unlikely. For month-to-month tenancies, the landlord must provide advance written notice before a rent increase takes effect. Oklahoma requires at least 30 days written notice before changes to the terms of a month-to-month tenancy. So if rent is due on the 1st and you want the increase to take effect on May 1st, you need to deliver the notice by April 1st at the latest. The notice should be in writing and should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the effective date. Oklahoma doesn't prescribe a specific statutory form for rent increase notices, but a clear written notice delivered by a documented method, personal delivery, certified mail, or posting on the premises, is always recommended. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term, unless the lease itself contains a provision allowing midterm increases. Common midterm adjustment provisions include escalation clauses, provisions tied to property tax changes, and clauses linked to CPI adjustments. Without such a provision, the landlord must wait until the lease expires to negotiate a new rent amount as part of a renewal or new lease. When a fixed-term lease is approaching expiration, the landlord should communicate the proposed new rent early enough for the tenant to make an informed decision about whether to renew. If the tenant agrees to the new rate, a new lease is executed. If the tenant doesn't agree, the lease expires at its natural end. If the tenant stays beyond the term and the landlord accepts rent, the tenancy converts to a month-to-month arrangement, at which point the landlord can implement increases with 30 days' notice. For week-to-week tenancies, the notice period for rent changes follows the one rental period rule, 7 days notice before the end of the weekly rental period. Now let's cover the restrictions that apply even without rent control. Rent increases cannot be retaliatory. Oklahoma has an anti-retaliation provision under the Residential Landlord and Tenant Act that prohibits landlords from taking adverse action, including raising rent, in retaliation for a tenant exercising their legal rights. Protected activities include making a good faith complaint about habitability to the landlord or a government agency, reporting a code violation, exercising any right under the Landlord-Tenant Act, and participating in a tenants organization. Oklahoma's anti-retaliation framework provides that if a landlord takes adverse action within a reasonable time after the tenant's protected activity, the tenant can raise retaliation as a defense. Courts evaluate the totality of the circumstances, the timing of the increase relative to the tenant's complaint, the magnitude of the increase, the landlord's history of increases on comparable units, and any other evidence suggesting retaliatory intent. A landlord found to have engaged in retaliatory conduct can face liability for damages and attorney's fees. The finding can also undermine the landlord's credibility in related legal proceedings, including eviction actions. The best protection is to document the legitimate business reasons for every rent increase and apply increases consistently across comparable units. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Oklahoma Fair Housing Act, found in Title 25, Section 1451 and following, landlords cannot raise rent based on a tenant's race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. The Oklahoma Human Rights Commission investigates fair housing complaints and can take enforcement action, including ordering damages, injunctive relief, and civil penalties. A discriminatory rent increase can be established through evidence of disparate treatment, meaning that tenants in a protected category were treated differently from comparable tenants who don't share that characteristic. Raising rent for families with children while keeping rates stable for units occupied by adults without children. Implementing larger increases for tenants of a particular ethnic background. Any of these patterns can support a discrimination complaint. The safest approach is consistency and documentation. Apply the same criteria for increases across all comparable units, and keep records of the market data, operating cost changes, and property improvements that justify your pricing decisions. From a practical standpoint, Oklahoma's rental market is anchored by two major metropolitan areas, Oklahoma City and Tulsa, with distinct secondary markets across the state. Oklahoma City has experienced steady growth driven by the energy sector, healthcare, aviation, and a diversifying economy. The city's relatively affordable cost of living compared to larger markets has attracted population growth and corporate investment. Rents in Oklahoma City have increased consistently in recent years, and landlords generally have moderate pricing power. The metro area, including Edmond, Norman, Moore, and Midwest City, offers a range of rental price points, and increases tend to track with the broader market trends. Tulsa has a similar growth trajectory, with economic diversification beyond its traditional energy industry base. The George Kaiser Family Foundation's investments in downtown revitalization, the Gathering Place Park, and other infrastructure have enhanced Tulsa's attractiveness. Tulsa's remote worker incentive program, Tulsa Remote, has also brought new residents to the city, increasing demand for quality rental housing. Landlords in Tulsa's desirable neighborhoods, including Midtown, Cherry Street, and Brookside, have seen strong rent growth. Norman, home to the University of Oklahoma, has a student-driven rental market where demand follows the academic calendar. Rent adjustments typically occur at the beginning of each academic year, and the student population provides a reliable demand base. Landlords in Norman can generally implement annual increases that reflect the market, though competition among student housing providers keeps pricing in check. Stillwater, home to Oklahoma State University, has a similar student-driven dynamic. The rental market is heavily influenced by the university population, and pricing decisions should account for the competitive landscape of student housing. Lawton, home to Fort Sill, one of the Army's most important training installations, has a military-driven rental market. A significant portion of tenants are active duty service members whose housing budgets are tied to the basic allowance for housing. Landlords near Fort Sill should monitor annual BAH rate changes when planning rent increases, as military tenants' ability to pay is directly linked to their allowance. Pricing above the BAH rate can make units less competitive for military renters. The energy-producing regions of Oklahoma, including communities in the Anadarko Basin, the Scoop and Stack Plays, and the Permian Basin periphery, have rental markets tied to energy industry activity. During production booms, demand increases and rents rise. During downturns, vacancies increase and pricing power declines. Landlords in these areas should be prepared for cyclical market conditions and should build financial reserves to cover periods of reduced demand. Rural Oklahoma has softer rental markets where large rent increases can be counterproductive. In many smaller communities, the population is stable or declining, economic opportunities are limited, and tenants have alternatives. Pricing must be conservative in these markets to avoid vacancies that are difficult to fill. One best practice for Oklahoma landlords: build rent increase provisions into your lease from the beginning. Include clear language about how rent will be adjusted at renewal, what notice period will be provided, and what factors will influence the new rate. A lease that addresses rent increases transparently sets expectations for both parties and reduces the chance of disputes at renewal time. Another best practice: consider the total cost of a rent increase, not just the revenue gain. A 5% increase on a unit renting for $1,000 generates an additional $50 per month, $600 per year. But if the increase causes the tenant to leave, the vacancy cost, including lost rent during the vacant period, cleaning, repairs, marketing, and the risk of a less reliable replacement, can easily exceed $3,000 or more. In most cases, retaining a good tenant at a slightly lower rent is more profitable than maximizing the rate on every unit. Oklahoma also allows landlords and tenants to negotiate rent escalation clauses that provide for automatic annual increases. These clauses can specify a fixed dollar amount, a fixed percentage, or a formula tied to an index like the CPI. Automatic escalation clauses give both parties predictability and eliminate the need for annual negotiation. They're particularly useful for multi-year leases, where the landlord wants to ensure that rent keeps pace with costs without having to renegotiate each year. For Oklahoma landlords who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, rent increases must be approved by the local housing authority. The authority evaluates whether the proposed rent is reasonable by comparing it to comparable unassisted units. Submit increase requests well in advance of the desired effective date to allow time for the review and approval process. Oklahoma requires landlords to return the security deposit within 45 days of the tenant vacating. While this doesn't directly regulate rent increases, landlords should understand that a rent increase doesn't automatically entitle them to collect additional security deposit from an existing tenant without a new agreement. Any change to the deposit amount would need to be negotiated as part of a lease renewal or amendment. For the complete guide to Oklahoma rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our Landlord Tenant Law series.